Good morning. Today is Thursday, November 9th, the year 2006, and this is the beginning of an interview with Ed Hall at the Office of Macomb Catholic Services, 15945 Canal Road in Clinton Township, Michigan. Mr. Hall currently resides at?
Troy, Michigan, 3388 Cleveland Road.
Very good. My name is Butch Goff, and I'll be the interviewer. I happen to know Ed from our history as young gentlemen growing up, and our videographer today will be Paul Wilhelm. Ed, would you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
I served in the Vietnam War, and the branch was the United States Army.
United States Army. Very good. Ed, let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school, and how you ended up in your branch of the service, which was the Army.
Sure. Grew up, born and raised on the east side of Detroit, real Detroit, not the suburbs, within the city limits on the east side. And went to a small Catholic high school, St. David's, and graduated in 1969. Now, at that point in time, it was before the draft lottery, and it was the real draft. And as you're aware, everyone was obligated for a minimum 2 years service, unless you had a deferment. As I was approaching graduation and thinking about it and thinking about my future, there actually were two guys that you know who did something that I turned out doing. What they did, it was Mickey Francisco and Mike Short. What they did is they volunteered their draft. They went down to the draft board and they said, draft me outside of high school, as opposed to enlisting, because as a draftee it was a 2-year obligation, as opposed to an enlistment, which was a minimum 3 to 4 year obligation. So it was a shorter obligation timeline, and you also had the benefit of picking the time that you went in, as opposed to...
You mean defer it?
No, actually selecting the time that you would go into the service, okay. Just like enlisting, as opposed to graduating from high school, starting to do something, and getting drafted out of the blue.
Right.
So it was a way that I figured in my 18-year-old mind, actually 17-year-old mind, that made sense to me. I knew I wanted to go to school, college, didn't know what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be. So in my thought process then, I figured that into the whole equation, and I said, you know, I think I'm just going to volunteer my draft. Now, of course, I didn't talk to my parents about this.
Right.
And in June of that year, after graduating from high school in June of '69, I turned 18 in June of '69, and I immediately went down to the draft board in downtown Detroit, filled out the paperwork to volunteer my draft. And being a true 18-year-old, I sort of liked the idea of having the summer to screw around. So we came to the conclusion that I would be inducted in October of that year. And that's what happened. So I was inducted into the United States Army as a draftee October 23rd of 1969. Mm-hmm. I recall going down to old Fort Wayne where the induction occurred, and there were probably 40, 50 guys.
Were you by yourself, or did you go with Mickey and Mike?
Oh no, Mickey and Mike, they were already in the service.
Okay.
So they were a couple years older, and they had done this.
Okay.
And they had already been back or close to coming back.
Right.
And so it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Right.
So I was by myself, and was with these 40, 50 guys. But one thing I remember about that induction was the sergeant went down the line, and every so often he would stop and he'd point, you, a couple others in the back, you come with me, you're going in the Marines. So technically speaking, when you were drafted, you were supposed to go into the Army. Mm-hmm. But if there was a need in one of the other branches, and at that time there was no need in the Navy or Air Force.
Right.
That's where most guys would enlist. given the option, but there was a need in the Marines. So that's the one thing I remember about the induction.
You go back a step here. Finally, what did Mom and Dad say and the rest of your family when you told them this is what's going to happen?
Well, my mom was the most vocal. She was upset, of
yeah.
course. My dad was a veteran, World War II veteran, a Marine. So I don't think it bothered him. I think
it worried him inside,
yeah.
But he was very honored that you were going to go do
well,
this.
I think there was this sense that that's what you did.
Right.
You know, you served your country. He did. My older brother had been in the Navy for about a year and a half, I think, by that time. My other brother had a medical deferment because he had a heart valve problem. So it just sort of was, you know, that's what was an expectation. Not that he ever said it, but it was sort of...
But Mom was upset.
Oh, yeah. You know, I was a fairly good student, and why didn't you go to college? And,
right. And the war has really escalated at this time, too, probably.
Well, in '69, if you look at the history, it had. The big turning point, as we all know, in the war in Vietnam, and a lot of this I didn't know at the time, and I've gone back, and of course, and learned the history much more so than I did at the time, was the Tet Offensive of 1968, which really turned the popular opinion of the public in the United States against the war. And it wasn't just college kids demonstrating against the war. There was a broader sentiment against it. And following that event in '68, in '69, they're probably '68 and '69, to my understanding, were the highest levels of number of troop deployed, etc. And I'll get into my history as things sort of changed over the coming year.
So here you are downtown, raising your right hand, swearing into the Army. Just got done with a fantastic 17, 18-year-old summer. What did you anticipate? What were you looking forward to? Where'd you go to boot camp? Give us a little reflection on that.
You know, in one sense, Butch, I was looking forward to being on my own, you know, being a grown-up.
Right.
Other than that, I didn't really have a clue. I knew I wanted to test myself and see what I was capable of doing.
Right.
So got drafted, as I said, and inducted, and went to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training.
Okay.
And part of my story is, as I recall, on the first several days of arrival to basic training, you take a battery of tests, and this is sort of important as my story goes on. The way I recall the way it worked for a draftee, and that's what they would do. They would segregate the draftees from the enlisted guys to a certain extent.
Right.
Because there were different tests that we've done. In general, the enlisted guys knew what their military occupation was going to be.
That's because they signed up for that.
Exactly. So they enlisted for, in general, a specific occupation.
You were just rolling the dice.
Rolling the dice. So as we rolled the dice those first couple of days and took these tests, I remember it very distinctly. There was one moment where they said, okay, put down 3 options for a military occupation. 2 of those 3 had to be combat arms. And the combat arms in the United States Army were the infantry, armor, and artillery. So basically what we were being told was 2 of your 3 options had to be out of those combat arms. The 3rd, wild card.
Okay.
Anything you could possibly think of that you knew about that was an occupation in the military. For some reason, and it might have been because I had this sense that I would have preferred to be helping people than shooting people.
Right.
I put down medical corpsman. Go through basic training, This by then is in November, December of '69. 8 weeks basic training at that point in time.
Physically, were you ready for the...
Yeah, I was in pretty good shape.
Okay. What about the, how can I say, the breaking of the spirit part of boot camp?
Actually, it wasn't quite as bad as I thought it would be.
Right.
It really, it did affect a couple of guys I remember in my platoon. But there was never a time that I felt, you know, oh man, this is just terrible and
right.
I can't tolerate it or anything like that. The very worst part of boot camp for me was there is one experience that everybody was required to have, was where they had this tear gas house where you had to go in with, and it was a training to put your gas mask on. And you had to go in there and go through this drill of being exposed to the tear gas and putting your gas mask on and ensuring that you were doing it in the proper way. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I remember that as the toughest part of basic training.
I remember that part too. So.
I remember coming out of there and crying and retching and
right.
that type of stuff. But towards the end, the latter week or two of basic training, we received our orders for advanced individual training, or AIT, what your occupation was going to be. Mm-hmm. And whether it had anything to do with my selection on that list, whether it had anything to do with the aptitude tests or,
right.
or whatever, they were sending me to medic school in Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas. So I came home, and it was over the holidays of that year. I had 2 weeks between basic and advanced individual training, and that worked out pretty nice. And went on my merry way to San Antonio and Fort Sam Houston for medic school. And
was Mom happy now that you...
Well, I don't think happy was the right word.
No.
But...
Okay. Relieved? No?
I think there was a sense that better than some
yes.
alternatives.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So, went through, medic school at that time was a 12-week program. And as I've now made a career out of it, I realized that it was pretty much advanced first aid. Mm-hmm. But at the time, to an 18-year-old, I was thinking I was learning some real good stuff.
You were ready for surgery.
There you go. Yeah, I was. You're right, Butch. I thought, you know, I had pretty good understanding of things. So,
now, are you apprehensive about getting this particular training, saying, I'm going to be put into a combat zone because I have this knowledge and ability? Or?
Well, as I didn't know it at the time, but as we talked about earlier, about there being a lot of activity in Vietnam, what had been occurring over the subsequent months was President Nixon started decreasing the number of troops in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So there was this very slow withdrawal of troops.
De-escalation.
Following 69, going into 1970.
Right.
And so I'm in medic school, and there's 400 guys or so in my class. Mm-hmm. And again, you get down to the end of the program, you get your orders for your next station of duty, where you're actually starting your occupation. And what I had been told in the past, in the mid to late 60s, out of that 400, 300 would have gone directly to Vietnam.
Right.
The other options would have been stationed anywhere in the world or the United States, and particularly in military hospitals.
Right.
And many of my classmates did get stationed in military hospitals. Again, whether it's a flip of the coin, chance, some grand design plan.
Right.
I was one of 40 out of the 400 that got orders to go directly to Vietnam.
Okay.
So That part my mom didn't like.
No. Did it put a little lump in your throat, or?
Yes and no.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, there was a big part of me that wanted to see what it was all about.
Okay.
Wanted to, you know, you have that childhood image of war and, you know, glory and that type of thing that you get from the movies and television growing up. And, you know, reading books like Red Badge of Courage, and you sort of, there was, make a long story short, there was a part of me that certainly was concerned.
Oh, yes.
But on the other hand, sort of welcomed it.
Okay.
And said, you know, and also, like most 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, you don't think you're going to be the one.
Right, right.
You think it's go, you know, let's go be somebody else. You're going to live forever. So, well, my mom was very upset, but after I got those orders, I was supposed to spend an additional week in San Antonio for what they called Arvin School, or a special week of training in the desert that was supposed to help prepare you for the transfer to Vietnam.
Right.
And the first night of that experience, I came down with the measles and got hospitalized at Brooke Army Hospital in Fort Sam, which is a famous burn center for the country. And didn't get my Vietnam training, but the sparse little, you know,
right,
week-long.
So after the measles, you're going?
After the measles, I go home.
Okay.
For another 2-week leave, and that was sort of nice too.
Yeah.
So, of course, spent time with my family and friends. A lot of the people you know, the Darians, those people. So, and then I'm on my way, and went to Travis Air Force Base in Oakland, California, for my flight, or series of flights to Vietnam. And I believe it was April 16th.
These other 39 grads, have they already been shipped over? And you're kind of like a two?
No. It wasn't like you were in a group.
Okay.
It was, you know, there was so much traffic coming and going, and I don't know if this has been brought out before, but one of the distinct differences of the Vietnam War was the way replacements came into the war.
Okay.
As opposed to what you see now in Iraq and what my understanding of World War II or Korea would have been. There were units that were trained together.
Right.
And went over as units and came back as units.
Right.
In Vietnam, it was very different. You had a 12-month in general tour of duty. If you went over by yourself, unless you were part of the very original units that went over there, that went over as a unit. But other than that, it began this pattern of activity where replacements would come in 1, 2, 3 at a time to already established units that may have been over there for years.
Right.
Because by this point in time, it's early 1970, April of 70, and there actually had been U.S. combat troops with a lot of activity for 5 years or more, depending on who you want to believe.
Right.
What history you want to look at, but so it wasn't like I went over with anybody that I knew.
Okay.
So I go over on this flight, and the thing I recall about the flight, of course, is the length. I think all told it was probably 24 hours or so, with several stops. Stop in Hawaii for a couple hours, a stop in Guam for a couple hours, stop in the Philippines before you come into.
Let me stop for a second. I have a question. Being an Army corpsman now, what does your uniform look like, and what gear are you carrying?
Okay, no gear that I'm carrying. All I've got is a pair of khakis. Okay. Maybe a dress uniform and another pair of khakis in my duffel bag.
That's it?
That's it, because you would get your real stuff
Okay.
when you got over to Vietnam.
I got you.
So you go to these land outside of Saigon, and I'm blanking on the name of the city right now. Long Binh.
Okay.
And fly into this airport, and the flights, by the way, this was sort of one of the surreal aspects. It wasn't a military flight.
Oh.
It was an actual commercial airline that at that point in time had contracted with the United States government to do this transportation back and forth from Vietnam. Stewardess on the flight.
Okay. Did you have coach or first class?
No, I was coach.
Okay.
I think we all were. I think we all were, but it was a little strange. Here
Right.
you got all these guys, you know, all nervous as get out, and here's a stewardess going up. You couldn't get any alcohol, though. So,
Right.
land outside of Saigon, and of course, the one thing that I remember, I had this vision that you're jumping off the plane and people are shooting
And
at
you're
you,
ducking.
and you're ducking and you're running, and of course, it wasn't that way. The American military had constructed by that time, over that 5, 6, 7-year period, main American bases that looked and felt like many of the bases back in the United States. And at that point in time, in the early 70s, we're fairly secure. You didn't know that going in,
Right.
but after being there a while, you sort of figured that out. So I go to this transfer station, and again, the only orders that you have is you are going to Vietnam. You don't know what unit you're going to with. You think you know what your occupation is going to be, but that could change. And actually, some of the guys we talked earlier about, the guys who enlisted,
Right.
some of them, if the need changed, they
Right.
went into the infantry.
Exactly.
So, and that happened to some guys that I saw. But anyway, you're there a couple days in these barracks, and you're sort of waiting to get your permanent orders or your orders to go to your assignment, what unit you're going with. And I get my orders, and I'm going to Quang Tri. I had never heard of Quang Tri. Growing up with the war, you know, I'd seen the TV shows. And
Stop there for a second. I have a question. Now you're in Vietnam and you're going to Quang Tri. In your medical training, okay, other than putting Band-Aids on and maybe learning how to give somebody a shot, were there any traumatic classes that you had to take and say, hey, you're liable to be in a combat zone and this is a wound that you have to address?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
There were very specific types of trauma that,
Uh-huh.
that we were trained, but again, the length of the training and the depth of the training,
Right.
It was wanting.
Right.
Because you couldn't, you know, really, again, have been in healthcare ever since then, a long time. Something that, for someone to take on those types of responsibilities would require a lot longer than 12 weeks.
Right.
So, and it's the type of situation where you don't really know what you don't know, and it was more on-the-job training
Absolutely.
than what you learned.
Okay. Now we're back to Quang Tri. I didn't
Yeah,
mean to interrupt.
that's
you.
okay. So I get these orders in Quang Tri, and I don't have a clue. Like I was saying, you know, I knew I'd heard of Saigon, I'd heard of Da Nang,
Right.
I'd heard of the big cities and the major areas, but I didn't have a clue with Quang Tri. And what the United States Army had done is that they had divided the country of South Vietnam into 4 very distinct zones. I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, 4 Corps. And with very distinct areas of operations in those areas. And Quang Tri happened to be in I Corps. I Corps was the northernmost part of South Vietnam. And what I did, they literally had this big map of South Vietnam posted, like you see at the mall, you are here. And I was able to find Quang Tri, and I look up there, and it's right there, and it's right on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And as I learned later, and learning the history of the war in the area, it had been an area that had been the responsibility and under the command of the United States Marines until 1969. And then there were Marine divisions that came back to the United States, and the United States Army took over for some of these areas. Very famous historical areas from 1968, the Tet Offensive, in this area of operations.
Give us a little brief look at the landscape when you got there.
The northernmost part of South Vietnam is very narrow. I don't know the exact width in terms of miles, but it's extremely narrow. But there's very clear topography or geography,
right,
in that the land is sloping upwards from the Gulf of Tonkin, right, or the China Sea. So on the far eastern part, it's flat. Beach, rice paddies, extremely flat, not like you would expect.
Right.
Starts to get a little hilly, maybe 10 miles inland. And then finally getting up into frank mountainous terrain.
Right.
As you go further west, and the westernmost border of that part of South Vietnam was the Laotian border. And Ho Chi Minh Trail being part of the Laotian border with South Vietnam, and that'll be part of my story in a little bit.
Okay.
But the unit I go to is the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division, mechanized, which consisted of 3 battalions, 3 combat battalions. A Armored Battalion, the 1st Battalion, 77th Regiment, Armored Regiment, what we would call a straight leg infantry battalion. In other words, grunts who walked most everywhere they went, and thus the term straight leg. And then a mechanized infantry battalion who would, in difference to the straight leg guys, would travel by armored personnel carrier, APC. So thus we were mechanized, we were mobile, we had the tank battalion, we had the mechanized infantry, and we had the straight leg infantry. Each battalion consisting of 3 line companies, typically companies A, B, and C. I get placed into the Armored Battalion. And the way the medical system was structured was that each battalion had a battalion aid station. From that battalion aid station, it was the central area where there was a battalion surgeon, an actual physician, and all the medics were assigned to that battalion aid station and then divvied out to the line companies as need would present itself. It wasn't a rule, but what they would try to do at that point in history was assign medics to a line field company for 6 months of your 12-month obligation and have you back at the battalion aid station, which is not unlike a clinic type setting.
Right, like a MASH type unit maybe?
Yeah, for 6 months. And again, it wasn't a guarantee or a written rule, but it was something they would try to do. And that, our battalion headquarters was at Camp Red Devil in Quang Tri Province, outside of Quang Tri City, which was the provincial capital. Flat land, probably the way I recall it, a huge American combat base, maybe 5 miles in width.
You got your uniform by now?
Oh yeah, I got it done the first day.
Are you carrying a weapon?
Not yet, because the first thing you do the first couple of days is you get another orientation.
Right.
And they sort of show you the lay of the land, and they take you out on guard duty in a bunker, and you know, you get scared out there, because you don't know what you're doing. But you went through a couple days of
Orientation. Yep.
and you're getting your equipment, and you're getting, used to the weather a little bit, which is extremely hot, by the way, in April, and most all of the year, but not all of the year.
Now the camaraderie, here you are, you don't know anybody,
No.
and here comes a corpsman that knows how to put a Band-Aid on, and so tell us about your experiences with some of the other fellow soldiers that you are meeting basically for the first time. It's like, you better be close to me when we're out on the line or something.
That's true, Butch. Actually, I get to the battalion aid station, and I immediately get assigned, after that couple-day orientation, to what the armored battalion called the Scout Platoon. Now, the Scout Platoon was a platoon that functioned very similar to the mechanized infantry battalion. And what their job was, they went out on armored personnel carriers and would scout various areas. So that was my first assignment. And as you mentioned, the good thing about being a medic was they took care of the medic.
Yes.
And the good thing about being an 18-year-old medic in Vietnam is, for the most part, you were with other 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who didn't know any different,
right,
who thought you knew as much as a doctor. So they're under this mistaken impression that, you really know what you're doing.
Right.
And I learned very quickly that was really what you had to do.
Right.
You had to, whether you knew it or not, you had to come across that you knew what you were doing.
Right.
To have some validity.
Let me flip this over. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay. So because basically you got to give an example of confidence.
Absolutely.
Because they're looking at you like, if I get hurt, you're the man that's going to fix me.
That's right.
You're the guy that's going to perform the brain surgery on me. So,
or save me until the medevac comes.
Right.
And keep me going until the medevac comes.
And you recognize that that's a role that you had to play.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that was my first experience, and I'd been with them, and I remember our first assignment was that we were guarding a bridge across Highway 1, which was a famous highway in Vietnam, ran the length of the country of South Vietnam, from the very southernmost tip of the country to the very northernmost, made famous by a book, Street Without Joy, and made very famous in later years, in the last days of the war, with scenes on TV of Vietnamese just flooding down this highway.
It was Saigon to get out.
So that was our first, and it lasted about a week, and nothing really happened.
No combat.
No combat.
Okay. So you're kind of sort of like a piece of cake.
Yeah, this isn't too bad. And of course, you're trying to soak in everything you possibly can from the guys who had been there, because as I explained earlier, there's a wide range of experience when you get to any individual unit. You've got guys who might be going home in 2 weeks.
Right.
Mingled with guys who had just arrived, mingled with guys who had been there for half their tour.
Right.
And there was a very ritualistic way we communicated about how much time you had left.
Right.
And it was really sort of a joke.
Right.
When you were a new guy.
Right.
Or there were 2 terms for a new guy. A noofer, which was the kinder term, or FNG.
Right.
Which was fucking new guy.
Got it.
So I was an FNG, but being a medic, they didn't call you out like they would one of their line brothers, because you don't mess with the medic again.
No.
So try to get by the guys that were experienced, and they would try to,
teach you and sort of passing the baton, because they know what you're going to go through.
Right.
and they're going to try and save your life just from their verbal experiences.
Right. So, with that unit, from there, we got an assignment to do a patrol where I actually experienced my first combat. We went to an area which was west and north of Quantree, sloping hills, elephant grass, clumps of vegetation in various areas, not thick jungle like
Right.
general public when they think Vietnam, they
Right.
think every inch of the country is this thick jungle all over
Right.
the place. The tactic that was used commonly was you would take the tracks or the armored personnel carriers to the highest ground in a general location, and you would circle the tracks just like a wagon train would. That's how I thought of it.
Right.
As I saw this happen time and time and again later on with tanks when I was on tanks. We'd get to the high ground, make a perimeter, circle it, and create a defensive position. But with the scouts, we would then dismount. We'd leave some guys behind with the tracks, and then we'd dismount and go on foot, just like infantry.
Okay. What are you carrying? How much does it weigh? You know, it's...
Yeah, I'm carrying a medic bag,
Right.
and it weighs probably 15 pounds.
Okay. It gets heavy after a while.
Oh, yeah. And I'm also I'm carrying an M16.
Okay.
And you know, I learned the Geneva Convention, medics are non-combatants, don't carry weapons, and all that stuff. But we didn't. That was out the door. Medics were not identified by their uniform in any way.
I was going to question, you don't have the bullseye with the red crosses on your patch or your helmets?
Not at all.
No, that's a target.
Yes, and that I don't know when they did away with that.
Okay.
Routine, but I was glad they did.
Yes, yes.
So we're on this patrol, and first time I've been doing this, and of course I'm nervous. And we had with us. So the picture is about 20 of us, and we have a lieutenant who's leading the patrol, but he's about mid-file. I'm within a couple people, maybe 4 people behind where the lieutenant was. And we also have a Vietnamese scout called a Kit Carson Scout. And Kit Carson Scouts were typically North Vietnamese, or NVA, who had come over to the South Vietnamese side.
Right.
And the term for that was called Chu Hoi, Chu Hoi, sort of by surrender. But they were Vietnamese who had come from the bad guy side to the good guy side.
And they knew this terrain and territory.
Knew the terrain and territory, knew the tactics of the enemy. And at that point in time, also, I think it's important historically to keep it into context. Most of the activity, most of the fighting, if not all of the fighting, was done between U.S. Allied forces and North Vietnamese Army regulars.
Okay.
Not Viet Cong.
Okay.
They're two very distinct entities. Viet Cong were the black pajama guys,
Right.
poorly equipped, poorly trained. South Vietnamese, sort of a Civil War type situation.
Right.
North Vietnamese, in contrast, one of the best trained armies in the world.
Right.
Heavily supported by China and Russian armament, supplies, very devoted to their cause.
And this is who you're going up against?
Yes, and this is at that point in time, that was pretty much all you were going up against.
Okay.
The early stages of the war, it was more against the Viet Cong.
Right.
And then as the war escalated and time went on, North Vietnam got more and more involved. China got more involved in their support. Russia got more involved in their support.
You do have a guy with an inside track.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So he's leading us down a certain way, and you never would travel on trails, but We came to a stream bed.
You blazed a new trail?
Yes, you blaze a new trail. But again, this wasn't, I don't want to give the impression that it was like some of the movies you may have seen where they're hacking through the jungle. It wasn't that type of territory in that particular spot. More elephant grass, maybe chest high to waist high. And we worked our way to this ravine. And the lieutenant and the scout made the decision that we'd go down into the ravine. So we go in the ravine. It's about waist-high water, and again, there's certain things, you know, even though this is quite many years, 36 years ago, a little longer than 36 years ago. There's certain things that, in certain moments that you remember like they were yesterday, and certain other things that you just can't piece them together. But the one thing I remembered very distinctly was having this thought that, you know, this is just like playing Army as a kid growing up. Got M16 over my head. I've seen this, and I've seen John Wayne do this. Walking through this water, and it's hotter than heck, and I've got the new fatigues on, and the point is that's the thought I had. But very quickly, the scout at the head of the column halts the column, and motions over to the side of the ravine, and what he had sighted was a bunker. And luckily there was no one in the bunker, but upon searching and investigation, it definitely was an enemy bunker with supplies and armament and food.
They had just left for something?
Yeah, left for something. So the lieutenant didn't like that, and moves us out of the ravine. And
he didn't like the situation in harm's way that you were in?
Yeah, so he said, we got to get out of this water. And moves us up on top into dry land, and we took a break. I remember that, and every time in the Army when you took a break when you possibly could, you smoked. So I remember smoking. I remember that's where I started smoking. I wanted to smoke. So it's funny how I think of that too. But anyway, after a brief break, the column started moving again, and we moved maybe 100 yards off that bank of the ravine. And the next thing I knew was the loudest noise I had ever heard in my life, and I'm on the ground. And
were you physically blown on the ground, or did you just hit the ground?
I don't know.
Okay.
All I know is I'm on the ground, and my head's ringing, and you know, you're stunned, and it takes a few seconds or some time to sort of get your senses about you. And I, being new, I didn't really have a clue what was going on. And in very short order, a couple of things start happening very quickly. I hear a lot of small arms fire from us. And then I start hearing a lot of yells for medic.
Yes, that term, medic. Medic.
Yeah, and again, my memories, you know, made it seem like, well, it was a long time. I'm sure it was seconds, but it finally clicked in where I sort of put two and two together, and I said, you know, you're the medic, and you got to do something here. So got up, and the first guy they motioned me to was this African American who had actually what had happened. It's probably better to tell that, but what had occurred was somebody had been waiting in the brush with a command detonated 500-pound bomb, and waited till a certain point in the column to detonate that
500-pounder.
Yeah, and this guy took heavy shrapnel in his groin, and he had one of the major artery to his leg ripped apart. Now, first time really saw blood. And when real blood. And when you get what we would call arterial bleeding like that, and he's laying on his back like this, and that blood is shooting up 10, 15 feet in the air. And I remembered my medic training.
Yes.
First thing you do to stop bleeding is pressure. So
Right.
I grabbed the compression bandage and wrapped in plastic.
Right.
Popped that sucker open, slapped it on, and just hold it there. And trying to get my wits about me, thinking about, you know, what else do I got to do for this?
What's next?
But while that's going on, I hear all these other shouts for medic.
Right, right.
And, you know, I'm just thinking, God, you know.
Your brain's on overload.
Yeah. What? Should I stay with this guy? You know, they keep screaming. And finally, and again, to me it might have seemed like minutes, I'm sure it was seconds. I finally grabbed somebody, I said, here, keep your hand here, and moved further up the column. And one of the pictures I have is of the guy who really had taken the brunt of the injury, Rocky Pearson O'Han. This is unit insignia, 1st Brigade, 5th Infantry Division.
Now this gentleman here was another one of the wounded that you ran to?
Yes, and that gentleman actually, and when you asked me earlier, did I know anybody or come over with somebody I knew, I actually met this guy on the plane coming over several weeks ago. So we both were real new.
Yeah.
We came in country on the same plane. I actually talked to him a little bit. He was from North Carolina. And about my age. I was a little younger than he, actually. But he had taken the brunt of the blast in his back. And was clearly, even though I hadn't experienced this before, was clearly in dire straits. He was
on his way to death?
On his way to death, turning blue, gasping for air, and I'm trying to assess what's going on, and see that he has multiple chest wounds in front, and what we would call these sucking chest wounds. And the way we were trained was you had to take the plastic wrapping off the compression bandages and cover these areas to make a tight seal on the chest, so that...
were they self-sealing type bandages?
No, you'd have to get tape and do, try to make them as self-sealing as well. But he had numerous wounds on his chest, and it got to the point that he stopped breathing. So I started doing cardiopulmonary resuscitation for the first time in my life. And in the meantime, they're still shouting to me. Medic, medic. And I also, you know, while all this activity is going on, I remember getting a very clear understanding that we had a medevac on the way.
This is an emotional experience now, also.
Oh, sure.
Besides your physical training, this is somebody you knew, somebody that's dying. You're in the middle of combat with other, you know, jobs calling out to you. It has to be a very stressful situation.
Well, it was, and as it turns out, I didn't leave his side. You know, they sort of told me, there was sort of this communication amidst all this chaos about so-and-so has this going on, and what, you know, what should we be doing? And,
I'll get to him when I can, but do this for now?
Type of thing. And eventually the medevac comes. It seemed like hours, but I think it probably was more like 15 minutes. And I've been doing CPR on Rocky here.
Now your company or platoon is firing. Are you receiving?
No.
Somebody just detonated this bomb?
Yes. Yeah. Now, at the time, being new, I didn't truly know that. But after the fact, you sort of piece things together and start talking through what went on. And really, you know, the other thing, I was talking about earlier about the medevac, the speed of the medevac, it probably was about 15 minutes or so, but again, that's just my guess and my estimate. And so we started loading the wounded on, and we actually had 7 wounded out of the 20.
Okay.
And Rocky was the most seriously wounded.
Now, in your experience, recognizing wounds and things like that now, how much life does he have left in it? Because medevac's coming in 15 minutes. If you get him there and they get him back...
in retrospect, Butch, he was dead in my arms.
Okay.
I'd been working on a dead man for 10 minutes.
Even though it was a little breath, and then you gave him a mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
You know, had it occurred 10 months later,
Right.
I probably would have left him.
Okay.
And had it occurred 10 months later, he might have gotten a little better treatment, actually, than he got from a fresh rookie.
Right.
Just new in the country. So I think about that as well.
That's a toughie.
Yeah. But the medevac comes, and we get the 7 wounded on there. Then after all the fact, we go back to the, where the tracks were, and sort of think through what happened and how it happened and that type of thing. So covered in blood. Had a few minor scrapes myself.
Right.
And this one guy who'd been there a while, he kept telling me, put yourself in for a Purple Heart, put yourself in for, and I said, I got, a little scratch, and I put a Band-Aid on, it's going to be okay in a couple of days.
Well, did this bomb detonate by itself? Somebody tripped?
No, we figured out, the guys who were experienced, in sort of policing up the area afterwards, no, this was a somebody detonated it. And they had their means of identifying that. And,
right.
And being the medic, I didn't,
right.
I trusted what they were saying. So, no, what the term for that was a command detonated. So somebody, as opposed to somebody just stepping on something.
Right.
This person.
Because they waited in, a certain spot in the column and said.
Yeah. And what we did recognize afterwards was when we started movement out from that ravine, the mistake that we made was we weren't blazing a new trail. What we did is we followed a track trail. Many of these areas had been patrolled for 4 or 5 years, and the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, it was easier for them to follow tracks that had been laid over time. And so, I don't know why, but we started going down one of these tracks, and certainly that's sort of what this guy.
Well, enemy knew you'd do this again.
Yeah, so. Yeah. So that was my first episode of combat, and then shortly after that, I got pulled back to the main base for a week or so, and then got reassigned to one of the armored company, the tank companies.
Right.
And I got assigned to Company B of the 1st Battalion, 77th Regiment, Armored Regiment, of the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division, and spent the next 7 months or so with that company as a platoon medic, and had other combat experiences. Never involved in what the general public would consider a major battle.
Right.
That isn't the way things worked over there.
Right.
There were a series of small firefights. Right. That would last minutes.
Right.
As opposed to some, 2, 3
big offensive or something.
Until later on in my tour of duty, when there was a big offensive.
In the meantime, here, I just don't want to rush you or push you, but what's happening at home with the people that, mom and dad and sister and brothers and?
They're doing a good job of writing, and I'm trying to keep up with returning mail.
No sendeth, no receiveth.
Mm-hmm.
Mail call was very important.
The most important thing.
Absolutely.
The most important thing. And I sort of, I don't know if laugh to myself is the right way to frame it, but The technology we have today,
Yes.
and they got the computers over in Iraq, and you email, and it's this instant type of communication. Obviously none of that in these days. And it was mail, and boy, mail call, if you got mail, you were golden.
Oh, yes.
And from anybody about anything.
Yeah, that's right.
It didn't
An article in
matter.
a newspaper.
Yeah. So,
So obviously now you've been tested, and you're a man.
yeah, sort of, yeah.
Yeah. You went from FNG to
Yeah.
somebody that has a little experience and knows what they're talking about.
Yep. And had, you know, in quick order, had gotten several promotions from when you immediately set foot in Vietnam, you became a private second class. You were private first class in basic and training.
Right.
And the minute you stepped foot in Vietnam, you became a private second class. Became a private PFC, private first class, within months, and then specialist 4 several months following that. Ended my tour of duty as a specialist 5th class. But getting ahead of my story here a little bit, but the things I remember about being with the armored company, we literally patrolled the northernmost part of South Vietnam, right on the DMZ, literally. There were 2 main bases. The United States Army had a strategy of sort of daisy chaining forward bases in case you got into trouble. The most distant one, you could fall back and fall back. And
Was your job there to keep the North Vietnamese from coming down?
Yes,
or just,
absolutely.
Because they didn't really care. If you were going to be there, they'd go past you and wreak havoc below you.
Yes, our job was to maintain the border, the northern border of South Vietnam, and to prevent massive invasion.
Right.
But again, from the North Vietnamese Army. And of course, the things I recall are you never felt safe. You always felt paranoid. We would get frequent rocket attacks at night. I got a picture that shows the northernmost base in South Vietnam, which the Army had designated Alpha 4, which became famous by the Marines. It was Can Tien. There were famous battles during Tet Offensive at Can Tien with the Marines. And you lived underground.
You learned to sleep very lightly.
Slept lightly. You lived underground in these United States Army engineered wood reinforced bunkers. Went out during the day.
Was this always in high ground too, by the way?
This particular base, it was higher ground, but it wasn't like it was on top of a hill.
Right.
But it was, you certainly had clear fields for a pretty good distance.
Right.
But the routine in those days were we'd go out either for day operations or maybe an operation that would last a week or so. We may do it in conjunction with infantry. We may do it in conjunction with the South Vietnamese Army. And, you know, we had episodes of, we had our fair share of combat, but others saw worse, others didn't see as much.
Could you assist South Vietnamese wounded and stuff like that? Or?
I could have. I didn't. I did assist some Vietnamese later on in my story, and I think I'll get there in a minute. But yeah, I could have.
Okay.
But they had their own
Right.
medics, and so did that, and a couple of other historical issues about being on tanks in Vietnam. The tank crew consisted of 4 men. The tank commander who sat on top with a 50 caliber machine gun, the driver who was in front, and now, by the way, I was on old vintage tanks from World War II in Korea, M48 A3s, and I believe their weight was, if I have this correct, about 60,000 pounds.
To being a medic now, were you concerned with some of these guys in the tank dehydration and things like that? Or?
No, not really, because one of the benefits of being on the tank is you got to carry more stuff with you. So we could carry more liquids.
Right.
things with us, and we had more things available to us. But the driver was in front, and then you had the tank gunner and the loader. That was the four-man tank crew. The medic was the extra wheel.
Right.
And the platoon consisted of 5 tanks.
Okay, one medic for 5 tanks?
One medic per platoon. And every one of the tanks always wanted the medic on the tank.
Yes.
But typically I would ride on the platoon leader's tank, the lieutenant's tank, and but at other times I'd ride on others' tank. So,
anytime you wanted a cigarette, one was there for you.
Oh
too,
yeah,
probably.
oh yeah. And then also during that period, the war is continuing to wind down, and this was something I wanted to get to. Also, that wasn't my individual experience, but I think was important to the history of the time. As the war, as the de-escalation became more pronounced, and as the anti-war sentiment became greater back home, it became very clear that the morale of the Army and other serving proportionally would just nosedive.
It was deteriorating.
Deteriorating. And that resulted into all sorts of other issues with drug addiction, lack of discipline, numerous conflicts between numerous groups, racial conflicts, black against white, not so much out in the field, but when you got back to the main base camp. Clear racial conflict and strife. Clear division between those that would be called lifers. Clear division between city boys and country boys. Clear division between those who would do drugs versus those who would do alcohol. And there were all certain terms for all of those things. But the one thing I wanted to comment on was that I personally witnessed and was associated with the treatment of 2 fraggings. And I don't know if anybody's ever talked about fraggings in these.
No, I understand.
But a fragging was a term used by the United States military where one American murdered another American.
For whatever reason? For
whatever reason, but the typical reason was, as this culture was evolving of lack of discipline, heavy drug use, no support from home. Who wanted to be the last one to die in Vietnam? What are we doing here? If you got in a unit with an officer who was looking to make a name for themselves,
very possibly he could be fragged.
He could be fragged. And if he was ordering the men to do things that they felt was unnecessarily, and the key word I think is unnecessarily, putting themselves at personal risk and danger.
Especially a short-timer.
Especially a short-timer. He was at risk of being fragged.
Right.
So I did actually see that happen out in the field at a base called U.S. Fire Support Base Vandergrift, which was out in the mountains in the west by Quai San. And I also, once I was back to the main base camp in Quang Tri at the battalion aid station, one night was awakened by a major who came stumbling through the back door of the aid station screaming he'd been shot in the head, and his companion had been shot in the head and murdered by a group of blacks because of this racial thing.
Right.
They had been coming home late at night from the officers' club. They had been partying.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I'll just go ahead. And the officers told them to turn down the music, and because of that and the lack of discipline and the drug use and all the other things I've been talking about, they shot them both and killed them. So I just wanted to make that point as well about this history of fraggings and Americans going after Americans. Came back to the main base camp after 7 months out on the field. Was a supply sergeant. I was a specialist 5th class by that time for the battalion aid station pharmacy. So I was sort of like the pharmacist.
Right.
Sort of neat, comfortable job. much less danger. The only thing you had to worry about was incoming rockets at night, which would occur maybe once a month or so. But then, in early 1971, the invasion of Laos was planned and executed, and the units I was with was part of that. And that was a major offensive where we had a couple miles worth of United States Army mechanized vehicles reoccupying bases that were made famous in 1968, Khe Sanh, this Vandergrift I talked about. And I had spent probably about a month in Khe Sanh, which is at the border of Laos. And the United States Army was not supposedly allowed to go into Laos itself. We were there to support the South Vietnamese. The idea was trying to buy time and to create damage to the Ho Chi Minh Trail,
right,
so that the U.S. would have time to exit the country and give the South Vietnamese army time to build themselves up.
Right, to take over their own battle.
Take over their own battle. And anyway, left. I ended up, did that, and then got back to the main base camp again. And what I did was, President Nixon started this early out program where if you came back from Vietnam with 5 months or less left in service, you would be discharged.
Right.
So what I did, I extended my tour of duty because I was back at the main base camp doing this supply farm,
right,
the sergeant thing, for an extra month and a half. So I ended up spending 13 and a half months in Vietnam.
Right.
Came home, got discharged, having spent a grand total of 19 months in the United States Army.
Yeah.
I was 19 years old when I came home, had my full GI Bill and this experience. And the only other thing I'd probably say is, again, at that point in our history, the thing looking back and reflecting on it, I was ashamed of my service, which I should have never been,
right, because
of peer pressure. And went into college that fall, and everyone was anti-war. I was young enough that I passed as an incoming freshman.
Right.
Didn't tell anybody about my service, so
right,
I could get by without talking about my service. And I regret not succumbing to peer pressure and not being a little more positive.
You were young and smart at the time, probably, to just blend in.
Yeah, and basically that's what I did.
Yeah. But as we get older, we recognize.
Well, the other thing, Butch, is you're well aware. What's happened as we gotten older is now it's gotten a lot more respect, and
absolutely,
rightfully so. So, I guess that's my story.
Well, I don't want to. I know everybody has things to finish up today, and I just want to make sure that we had Ed Hall and friends, and here you are on one of your tanks, correct?
Yes, that's in Coventry Combat Base. That's Bad Bart, I believe, on the left.
Yes, Bad Bart Bartholomew.
Yeah, from California, and Dapper Dan.
Are you in contact with any of these gentlemen?
No, I'm not.
No? No? Any acquaintances from the military, Army?
No.
No?
No. I've tried through the internet, and haven't been able to.
Here's
This is near Khe Sanh. This is infantry group we have been working with in the Ba Long Valley, which is near Khe Sanh, and unfortunately on this operation, this gentleman.
Were you a member of any military organizations, VFW or anything like that?
When I first came back, I was a member of VFW for a very short period of time.
Right.
I was still awfully young, Butch, and most of those gentlemen were quite a bit older, and so.
Well, I know currently we're at war, and I myself, being a veteran.
This is a shot of Alpha 4 Combat Base, which was the base I talked about, the northernmost part of South Vietnam. You could spit on the demilitarized zone from this area, but this is a shot that's looking west. You see these sort of hills to the west, pot-marked with bomb craters.
What do you tell your sons about your military experience, and how do you feel about them? I personally don't want my sons to go through what I went through. Yet, being a veteran, And like your father, it's what a man does, and yet, being a dad, I don't want to put my children in harm's way.
Well, I would agree with that, and I certainly haven't encouraged them to do so. If they would have opted to do that of their own free will, I would have respected that. But it's Lieutenant Evans from Pennsylvania. I'm sorry.
Yep, that's him. All these people are survivors?
Yes, and here's a sad footnote. The two on the end came home, and actually all four of them came home, but the two in the middle, unfortunately, came home as hardcore IV heroin addicts.
Oh.
This is a shot at Camp Red Devil, Quang Tri, and you can see the hooches that this is a fairly secure area. This isn't out in the bush, so to speak.
Well, because of that war and the social issues, and not only did, you had casualties of war, and not just from combat, but from drug addiction and other things, and that made that war significantly a part of history that a lot of people don't realize what our social world has changed into.
You're right. This is M48A3 tank. We're working with the infantry battalion, and that's their track, their armored personnel carrier to the side of it, right there. And this, again, if you look at the topography, this isn't what most people would think about when they think about Vietnam.
Right.
They would think some jungle, but you did get a nice shot of the hills before Paul. The hills, you had a close-up of these hills off to in front of the tank, which shows, it gets you a little flavor. You see the sort of the barren spots. Those are all bomb craters from B-52 attacks over the years. And when you get up close to them, they're huge, 20 feet wide. Again, this is right on the DMZ.
Well, Ed, I know that this story is really a lot longer than the hour or so that you've taken to tell it. And I personally know you, and I know your family. I know how proud I am to know you, and I'm honored for your service. I know that based on your experiences, you came from a great background. You survived all of this, and you currently are in the medical field.
Yes, this really set the tone for my whole life. I'm currently an administrator. My title is Associate Hospital Director.
Never wanted to be that doctor?
At a certain point, but it just didn't work out that way.
I understand.
And actually, I'm very happy the way things worked out, because now what I do is I boss doctors around.
Well, there again, I am proud to know you. I'm honored for your service. You're a man's man.
Thank you.
Paul, do you have anything to add or say?
No, just thanks again for your
Thank
service and for coming in to visit with us today and tell us your story.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It wasn't too bad.
No, it wasn't.
And I can tell you this, as you're going along, I said, there's a lot here, but we're not going to get it all.
Yeah.
It just can't.